When a man like Michael Caine pauses to speak about the films that shaped him, it is never merely nostalgia. It is memory, carefully unfolding. Born in 1933 in working-class London, Michael Caine rose from wartime hardship to become one of cinema's most recognizable voices. So when Caine finally revealed the 7 films that stayed closest to his heart, it wasn't simply a list, it was a lifetime distilled into cinema. Number 1. Lawrence of Arabia. For Michael Caine, the first film on his list carries the feeling of revelation. Not the kind that arrives suddenly, but the kind that grows quietly while you sit in a dark theater and realize the screen in front of you is showing something larger than storytelling. He first saw Lawrence of Arabia in the early 1960s, long before fame found him. At the time, he was still a young actor trying to understand the craft, taking small parts, attending auditions that rarely led anywhere, and wondering whether cinema would ever open its doors for him. And then the desert appeared. The vastness of David Lean's vision stretched across the screen like a living painting. Sand, sky, and silence moved together in a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. But what stayed with Caine most was not the scale of the film, it was the stillness at its center. Peter O'Toole's performance as T.E. Lawrence had a quiet magnetism. He didn't rush through emotion. He didn't try to dominate the frame with volume or theatrics. Instead, he stood there with a calm confidence, letting the camera come to him. For a young actor watching from the darkness of a theater seat, that restraint was a revelation. Caine would later say that O'Toole showed him something many actors never fully grasp, that presence on screen does not come from movement, but from control. The audience does not always respond to the loudest moment. Often, it is the pause before the moment that holds the power. Watching Lawrence of Arabia, Caine understood that cinema had its own language, a language of silence, tension, and patience. Every glance carried meaning. Every pause felt deliberate. It was a kind of storytelling that trusted the audience to lean closer. That idea stayed with him as his own career began to slowly take shape. When he later appeared in films like The Ypres File and Get Carter, viewers noticed something different about him. Caine didn't overplay his characters. He held back just enough to make the audience curious. And that instinct, he often admitted, came from watching Peter O'Toole walk across the desert with nothing more than calm certainty. There is also something else about Lawrence of Arabia that resonated deeply with him, the film's understanding of solitude. The vast landscapes mirror the loneliness of the man at the center of the story. It is a film about ambition, identity, and the strange burden of becoming larger than your own life. Number 2. The Third Man. If Lawrence of Arabia showed Michael Caine the power of stillness, the second film on his list revealed something just as important, the beauty of mystery. The Third Man arrived in cinemas in 1949, a post-war thriller set among the broken streets of Vienna. For many viewers at the time, it was simply an unforgettable film noir. But for Caine, watching it years later as a struggling young actor, it felt like something far more profound. The world the film presents is one of shadows. The streets feel uncertain, tilted, almost unstable. Director Carol Reed shot the city through crooked angles and long stretches of darkness, creating a mood that feels both haunting and strangely poetic. And then there was Orson Welles. When Welles finally appears as Harry Lime, he does so not with noise or spectacle, but with a smile that feels both charming and dangerous at the same time. It is one of cinema's most unforgettable entrances, a man stepping out of the shadows, suddenly illuminated by a passing light. For Michael Caine, that moment carried a lesson he would remember for the rest of his life. Characters, he realized, are rarely simple. Before watching The Third Man, Caine had grown up thinking of stories in clear terms, heroes on one side, villains on the other. But Wells's performance erased that easy division. Harry Lime was charismatic, funny, and deeply unsettling all at once. The audience is drawn to him even as they begin to understand the darkness beneath his charm. That contradiction fascinated Caine. He once reflected that great acting does not come from judging a character, but from understanding them. Even the most questionable figure believes in his own reasoning. Harry Lime never sees himself as a villain, and that makes him more human, and therefore more unsettling. Watching the film during those early years of his career, Caine began to see acting differently. The camera, he realized, is drawn to complexity. It doesn't want perfection. It wants contradiction. That idea shaped many of the roles he would later become famous for. When audiences watched him in Get Carter, they saw a man who was both calculating and strangely vulnerable. In The Quiet American, he portrayed a journalist whose moral compass drifts quietly between love, loyalty, and regret. Number 3. Casablanca. If the third man taught Michael Caine the power of ambiguity, the third film on his list revealed something even more delicate: the quiet strength of emotion held in restraint. For many people, Casablanca is remembered as one of the most romantic films ever made. Released in 1942 during the height of World War II, it told a story of love, sacrifice, and impossible choices. Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman created a screen partnership that has echoed through cinema for generations. But when Michael Caine speaks about Casablanca, he rarely begins with the romance. Instead, he talks about the rhythm of the performances, the pauses between words, the way a single glance can reveal more than an entire speech. As a young actor studying films whenever he could, Caine watched Bogart carefully. There was something unusual about the way Bogart carried himself on screen. He didn't rush through dialogue, he didn't chase emotion. He allowed it to appear naturally, as if it had been there all along. In many scenes, Bogart says very little, and yet the audience understands everything. That kind of emotional control fascinated Caine. Because the truth is, great acting often happens in the spaces between the lines. It lives in hesitation, in the small moment where a character almost says something, but doesn't. Watching Casablanca, Caine began to understand that silence could carry enormous weight. Rick Blaine, the character Bogart plays, is a man who hides his heartbreak beneath a calm exterior. He moves through the smoky rooms of Rick's cafe with a kind of quiet dignity, rarely revealing what he truly feels. But the audience senses it anyway. That, Caine realized, was the genius of the performance. Emotion was not announced, it was implied. Years later, when Caine became known for his own understated acting style, critics often described his performances as controlled or economical. He never appeared to be forcing emotion onto the screen. Instead, he allowed the audience to discover it slowly. That instinct, he often admitted, was influenced heavily by Bogart. Number 4. Zulu. If Casablanca taught Michael Caine the power of emotional restraint, the fourth film on his list holds a different kind of meaning altogether, because this time, the lesson was not learned from the audience. It was learned from the inside. Zulu, released in 1964, was the film that introduced Michael Caine to the world. Before it, he was another struggling actor navigating small roles and uncertain opportunities. After it, he became something else entirely, a leading man. But the story behind that transformation is far less glamorous than people might imagine. When Caine first arrived on the set of Zulu, he felt like an outsider. The film told the story of the Battle of Rorke's Drift, where a small group of British soldiers defended a remote outpost against a vastly larger Zulu force. It was an epic production filled with sweeping landscapes, military formations, and an atmosphere of disciplined tension. Caine had been cast as Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, a British officer from an aristocratic background. There was just one problem. Michael Caine was not aristocratic. He had grown up in South London, the son of a fish market porter and a cleaning woman. His accent carried the unmistakable rhythm of the working class. In the British film industry of the early 1960s, that background was not exactly considered suitable for portraying upper-class military officers. Caine himself feared he might be dismissed after only a few days of filming. Surrounded by seasoned actors and military advisors, he worried that someone would notice he didn't belong in that uniform. But something interesting happened when the cameras began rolling. Instead of trying to overpower the role with exaggerated authority, Caine did something much simpler. He stood still, hands clasped behind his back, posture straight, voice calm, and suddenly, the character came to life. Director Cy Endfield noticed it immediately. The quiet composure Caine brought to the role gave Bromhead a natural sense of command. He didn't shout orders across the battlefield. He delivered them with controlled certainty. That approach created a striking contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. For Caine, the experience was transformative. He later reflected that Zulu taught him an important truth about leadership both on screen and in life. Authority does not always come from volume. Often, It comes from confidence. Number 5. On the Waterfront. If Zulu gave Michael Caine confidence, the fifth film on his list gave him something even more important, a new understanding of what acting could be. The film was On the Waterfront, released in 1954 and starring Marlon Brando in one of the most celebrated performances in cinema history. By the time Caine saw it, he had already begun pursuing acting seriously. Like many young performers of that era, he had studied technique, voice control, and stage discipline. Acting, as he understood it then, was about precision. You hit your marks. You spoke clearly. You delivered emotion in a structured, almost theatrical way. But when he watched Brando as Terry Malloy, all of those rules suddenly seemed less certain. Because Brando didn't perform the way other actors did. He felt real. His voice sometimes trembled. His words occasionally stumbled. His gestures seemed unplanned, almost accidental. Instead of presenting a polished performance, Brando allowed the audience to see the character thinking, struggling, reacting in real time. For Michael Caine, that approach was revolutionary. The famous taxi scene between Terry Malloy and his brother remains one of the most studied moments in film acting. When Brando quietly says, "I could have been a contender," the line lands not as a dramatic speech, but as something painfully honest. It sounds like a confession. The power of that scene lies in its vulnerability. Terry Malloy is not a heroic figure in the traditional sense. He is a man haunted by missed opportunities, by the quiet realization that his life could have been something different. Brando does not hide that sadness. He lets it exist openly. Watching that moment, Caine realized something profound. The audience connects most deeply with truth, not perfection, not elegance, but authenticity. That insight changed the way he approached his own craft. Before On the Waterfront, Caine might have focused on how a scene should look or sound. After watching Brando, he began thinking about how a character should feel. The difference may seem subtle, but for an actor, it is enormous. It means listening instead of performing, reacting instead of controlling, allowing the unexpected to appear in the moment. Number 6. The Godfather. If On the Waterfront revealed the power of vulnerability, the sixth film on Michael Caine's list showed him something equally powerful, the authority of quiet control. By the time The Godfather arrived in 1972, cinema itself was beginning to change. The polished studio system that had defined earlier decades was giving way to a new generation of filmmakers who favored realism, moral complexity, and slower, more deliberate storytelling. Directed by Francis Ford Coppola, The Godfather became the defining film of that new era. For Caine, watching it for the first time was like witnessing a new language of cinema being spoken. The film was filled with unforgettable performances. Marlon Brando as the aging Don Vito Corleone, James Caan as the impulsive Sonny, Robert Duvall as the loyal consigliere Tom Hagen. But the performance that fascinated Caine most was Al Pacino's transformation as Michael Corleone. At the beginning of the film, Michael appears almost detached from the world of crime surrounding his family. He is quiet, reserved, even hesitant. When he tells his girlfriend Kay, "That's my family, Kay. It's not me," he seems sincere. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changes. Scene by scene, Michael evolves. Not through loud declarations or dramatic outbursts, but through subtle shifts, the tightening of his expression, the steady confidence in his voice, the calm authority with which he begins to command the room. For Michael Caine, that transformation represented a masterclass in screen acting. Pacino never rushed the character's evolution. Instead, he allowed the change to unfold gradually, trusting the audience to recognize the moment when innocence quietly gives way to power. One of the most striking aspects of Pacino's performance is his stillness. He often speaks softly, rarely raising his voice. Yet when Michael Corleone finally steps fully into his role as the new Don, the effect is chilling. Power radiates not from aggression, but from control. Caine admired that restraint deeply. Throughout his own career, he had already learned that quiet confidence can dominate a scene more effectively than shouting or dramatic gestures. Watching Pacino refine that principle so precisely reinforced the lesson. Great performances do not always demand attention. They command it. Number 7. The Quiet American. The final film on Michael Caine's list carries a deeply personal meaning. Unlike the others, It is not simply a film he admired from a distance. It is a film he lived. The Quiet American, released in 2002 and based on the novel by Graham Greene, arrived during a later chapter of Caine's career, a time when experience had replaced ambition and reflection had begun to shape the roles he chose. In the film, Caine portrays Thomas Fowler, a weary British journalist living in Vietnam during the early stages of political turmoil that would eventually reshape the region's history. Fowler is not a heroic figure in the traditional sense. He is tired, thoughtful, and morally conflicted. He observes the world around him with the calm skepticism of a man who has witnessed too much. For Caine, stepping into this role felt less like acting and more like understanding. By this point in his life, he had spent decades navigating the complexities of fame, success, disappointment, and reinvention. He knew what it meant to carry memories, to recognize the quiet weight of choices made long ago. That understanding brought an authenticity to the performance that critics immediately recognized. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination, but for Caine, the experience meant something deeper. It felt like a moment of artistic honesty. Thomas Fowler spends much of the story wrestling with questions of responsibility. As political tensions rise around him, he finds himself caught between personal loyalty and moral conviction. He loves the country he lives in, yet he cannot ignore the growing consequences of foreign influence and quiet manipulation. These themes gave the film a sense of quiet urgency. But what fascinated Caine most was the character's emotional landscape. Fowler is not driven by ambition or ideology. Instead, he moves through the story with the reflective patience of someone who has learned that life rarely offers simple answers. That emotional maturity mirrored Caine's own stage in life. He once remarked that younger actors often rely on imagination to create their characters. Older actors, however, have something else. Listening to these 7 films, you begin to realize something remarkable. Michael Caine was not simply naming favorites. He was revealing the moments that shaped his understanding of cinema, character, and the quiet art of storytelling. After more than 70 years on screen, Michael Caine still speaks about film with the curiosity of a student, because great cinema, like great music, never truly fades. Michael Caine's reflections remind us that the golden age of cinema was never defined only by spectacle or fame. It was defined by artists who understood that the smallest gesture, the quietest pause, could hold an entire story. As Caine once said, the secret of acting is listening not just to the other actors, but to the moment itself.